the deer in the antelope play.
Hello, my name is Michael Ware. That's spelled W-A-R-E. I spell it all the time for people when I'm ordering stuff on the phone or picking up my dry cleaning, but I've never really paid attention to what it means. Years back, I heard a story about one of my ancestors coming to America, but I never really got the details. I honestly didn't care much back then. It probably wasn't until my grandfather died in 2007 that I realized the importance of ancestry. So here I am in London, England, on a quest to find my ancestors, to pay respects to their graves, and to hopefully find a distant cousin or two along the way. So sit back and relax and enjoy George's journey.
Please mind the gap between the train and the platform. This is Hounslow East. This is a Piccadilly line service to Heathrow Terminals 4 and 123.
London is an epic city, but not when you're jet lagged. People everywhere, and I thought San Francisco had a lot of tourists. So I took off a few days to acclimatize and see the sights. After a couple days exploring London, I was ready to go. I had done some research before I left, and here is what I knew. There once was a man named George who lived in England. He married a fine lady named Naomi. It rained a lot in England. They had a son. His name was Samuel. Samuel was not alone. He was one of 13 kids. George and Naomi took Samuel and a few other children and left England on a boat for the New World, never to return. Our records go back 13 generations. As you can see, that's George and Naomi right there in the middle. They're the 6th generation back. Samuel is right below them. He married a fine lady named Alice, and they had a big family as well. And one of their sons they named Samuel, who then married Clarissa. Then they had a son, Samuel Guy, who married Orlinda. And then they had a son named Lavar, who married Ione. Lavar and Ione, my grandparents, had a son named Philip, who married Sarah. And Philip and Sarah had a son named Michael. That's me, by the way. Looking back at 13 generations before me really put some serious pressure on me to step up my game and have kids of my own. I would really hate to be the one to break that chain. So if there's any ladies out there who really want cute, brown-eyed babies named George or Samuel, give me a call. So those are the generations after George. But the purpose of my trip is to focus on the generations before George, here in England. Our records go back to 1560 with a man whose last name is Ware. He had a son named William, then Solomon, then Attained, Smith, and then 2 Georges. Along the line, they married 5 Elizabeths in a row. Pretty interesting to think that they all married into the family, so none of them could have been named after each other. Elizabeth must have been a really popular name back then. So with that information, I was off into the English countryside to retrace my history. Da 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 da. Sorry, I had to do it. Every generation before George left to America lived and died and was buried in the state of Kent, England, the southeast corner of the island. So that is where I had to go. It all started in Brenchley. That's where William lived. Then on to Goudhurst, where Solomon was buried. Then to Headcorn, where Attain lived. Then Smarden, where Smith and George's grandfather lived. And then Lenham, where George and his dad lived. And finally Hollingbourne, where George's dad was buried.
So this is Brenchley. This is where it all began.
Welcome to Brenchley. If you blink, you'll miss it. There's the main church. That's where the cemetery is. The old church is surrounded by the old cemetery. The entrance is a beautiful, narrow path lined with trees. The church is much older than the 1600s, so I'm sure that William Ware walked down it many times when he went to church. I imagined William and Elizabeth pulling their son Solomon reluctantly to church services. Some things never change. I had never seen anything like it. Cemeteries like this do not exist in the United States. At least half of the graves were older than the Declaration of Independence. It was so fun to walk around and explore.
Gotta be the coolest cemetery I've ever been to. So green and so old. The tombstones, maybe past 1850, are wiped away. You can't read anything on them. Our ancestors left Brenchley before 1800, so we trace them back to 1500, when we didn't even have a name. It was just Ware. But most likely our ancestors are buried here. Several generations. Pretty neat experience.
Next door is the main pub and restaurant, called The Bull. I had spoken to the leader of the church, and I decided to grab some authentic British food and make a video entry of my progress. What happened next was totally hilarious. The hostess didn't realize that I was filming and assumed that I was talking to her. It's great insight to how friendly the British people really are. Watch.
So here I am at the Bull Inn.
Yeah,
Right
it's
next-
full.
right next
Yeah. It's quite an old part of the town, obviously, because of the houses across the road. And then, like I say, if you've been up to Matfield yet, which
No.
is in that direction, worth it. If you've got a car.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you go in that direction, you've got Matfield, which is very pretty. It's got like a beautiful village pond. I don't think there's any pictures. I think these are all of Brenchley. But yeah, it's really pretty. There's lots of the villages. They're all hopping villages. You know what hops are, yeah? The
I
next
do.
bit. Yeah. So, yeah, so everything around here is hop villages. That's predominantly what, I guess, we're focusing on apple growing around
Apples
here.
and hops. Well, I trace my ancestors right back to this cemetery in 1500. That's why I'm here.
So you're on like an expedition to
I
try
am.
and find out
I've come
where
across the pond
from America.
to America
Whereabouts?
looking for Salt Lake City and San Francisco.
Yeah. So you travelled a long way
Yeah.
from the West Coast.
And the furthest I can go back is in this cemetery right here. 1500. And I only have a last name. They don't even have a first name on
So
that.
you've done really well to even find that much.
That's like 11 generations back. 11 generations. And they're buried, 2 generations were born and died in this cemetery with the last name of Ware, W-A-R-E.
You've done a really good job because that's probably quite a common name as well, I would imagine. So,
I've been around, have you heard of anyone with that last name?
around here.
W-A-R-E, alright. Alright.
But you've got the phone book.
I know, I'll look at the phone book.
Trace through the phone book and see, because that will be the best way of finding out, I guess, at the end of the day. Yeah, the phone book. That's where I would have started, probably. But speak to the vicar and see if he's got, because obviously I have archives, so the rest of it go right the way back. So.
The most British meal on the menu.
Where
Thank
it
you
was
so
I
much.
said you either need a fryer or a roast dinner first.
Fry up and roast.
Since we're out both.
Yeah, you'll have to have a fry up tomorrow. Do you want any ketchup or anything?
Ketchup, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's English, so.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
What I was going to say in the last video is that I spoke to the vicar, who is the leader of the church. And he let me know that the graves before the early 1800s are too old to distinguish. I'm sure that our ancestors are here, but we'll never know which grave. From Brenchley to Goudhurst is only a 20-minute drive, but back then, it wasn't an easy move. Solomon would have had to receive permission from the local government. Goudhurst is slightly larger and centered by a beautiful pond with immaculate landscaping and old red brick homes. The cemetery is larger too, and just as beautiful. But with just one look, I knew that the engravings of Solomon's 1662 headstone were taken by the elements probably 100 years ago. So I walked around and imagined which one was his. Could it be one of these knights' tombs, maybe? Or perhaps this lonely one? Or maybe this one leaning against his friend? We'll never know. But one thing we do know is who buried him. Inside the beautiful church is a list of the clergy going back to 1210. Solomon died here in 1662, and a year before that, an Edward Thurman took charge. As I drove to Headcorn, on one hand I was amazed by the beautiful cities and cemeteries, and on the other hand I was disappointed that I hadn't found anything yet. And unfortunately, in Headcorn, it wasn't going to get much better.
Okay, you can actually hear the bells going off in the church. I am in the Headcorn Church and Cemetery. This is where Solomon's son, Attained, was born and died.
Okay, here's the gist of it. This is where Attained and Elizabeth got married and had a son, Smith, who later moved to Smarden. They are both buried here together, but once again, the elements of time have erased their engravings. So off I was to Smarden, where Smith is buried and where both George's father George and grandfather George were born. The entrance to Smarden is a really tight squeeze, so it's a good thing I had a European-sized car. I searched every gravestone in the Smarden Cemetery, hoping to find Smith and Elizabeth.
Okay, here I am in Smarden, and just as I start talking, the bells go off. That's a sign of something good. So I'm in Smarden, Kent, England, and I just came from Headcombe. So I'm here visiting, looking for Smith Ware's grave. And this is not Smith Ware's grave, don't get your hopes up. But Smith Ware died in this cemetery in 1778. And for the first time on my journey, I found a headstone that's roughly the same age as the person I'm looking for. That's a win for me, all right? I'll take it.
Another strikeout. Damn you, Father Time. rubbing away all evidence of my ancestors. This definitely wasn't how I imagined it on the plane. Nonetheless, Smarden was another absolutely stunning cemetery. Here is another list of the church leaders. William Bedford probably counseled Smith and maybe even spoke at his funeral. So I was off to Lenham. Most of Kent is really green and lush, but Lenham was distinctly different. It had golden hills filled with grains like barley and hops. So I stopped to do a quick introduction. What I didn't realize is that there was a hidden ditch along the road, and I fall right about... Fast forward 20 seconds and a few Spanish swear words later, I was able to get out of the ditch. I just fell in a huge ditch. Full of spiny raspberry bushes. You can see I have a raspberry on my knee. Oh man, I thought I was gonna never stop falling. Welcome to Lenham. Note to self, no flip-flops in England. It's full of stinging nettle and spiny plants and random holes. Just for fun, check out the ditch that I fell in. It runs along the road and is completely hidden, probably to keep out random Americans like myself. According to my research, George's grandfather George is buried here, in Lenham. After searching the graves, I finally found a Ware. No, it wasn't George's grandfather, but it was George's Uncle James, son of the man I was looking for. He was buried with his wife Harriet and surrounded on both sides by his children. By now I was an expert on Kent cemeteries, and I knew that George had to be close. Most families are buried together in a line, usually in chronological order starting from the path outwards. So George had to be here somewhere close. I searched again and found nothing. I did, however, uncover this small, flat, worn-down gravestone next to and in line with the other Wares, the one there at the bottom. Judging by its condition and proximity to the path, it was presumably older than the others. Could this be my George? It was impossible to tell because I couldn't read the stone. As the rain started, I left the cemetery with more questions than answers. My last stop, Hollingbourne. Our family history records indicate that George's father George died in the Union Workhouse in Hollingbourne and was buried there. I decided to check the Hollingbourne Cemetery first, just to make sure he wasn't there, and then try to find the Union Workhouse. By the way, what's a Union Workhouse? I searched every grave, but no George. So next, I needed to research this Union Workhouse. Hopefully, it has a nice big grave with George's name on it. I mean, come on, he died in 1854. A new grave like that must be in perfect condition, right? I asked around in Hollingbourne, and everybody said that the Union Workhouse is long gone. But I needed a definite answer, and I knew just the place to go. The Kent History and Library Center in Maidstone holds all of the family history records for Kent County. Inside the library is a large, secure glass room with lots of archives. It took an outsider like me a while to get access, but once I did, I was completely overwhelmed. It must have been obvious because a nice British fellow named Richard, who just happens to be a Kent family history expert, asked me if I needed help. He graciously spent the next couple of hours helping me research the Wares in Kent, particularly Lenham. To start, I confirmed that the Hollingbourne Union Workhouse does not exist anymore. Here is an old photograph before they tore it down. The Union Workhouse was, quote, a place where those unable to support themselves were offered accommodation and employment. Anyone living there was called an inmate, and most were employed on generally pointless work, such as breaking stones. Life in a workhouse was intended to be harsh, to deter the able-bodied poor, and to ensure that only the truly destitute would apply, unquote. Only the homeless went to the Union Workhouse. It was straight out of Oliver Twist. He was most likely alone, because otherwise he would have gone with family members. He had no money, or else he wouldn't have resorted to such extreme measures. He died in the worst conditions imaginable, as a virtual slave. Earlier in his life he had money, because the Wares owned land in Lenham, and his dad had a business that he passed along to his brother James. So what could have happened to him that he ended up here? Richard confirmed that he died in the Hollingbourne Union Workhouse, but he couldn't find any burial records. My records indicate that he was also buried in the workhouse, but Richard thought otherwise and was dead set on proving my source wrong. And there it was, boom, George Ware on the death records. But it wasn't in Hollingbourne. It was in Lenham. They had moved his body back to Lenham to be buried. People from the Union Workhouse were almost always buried in unmarked graves due to their extreme poverty. That means that George was buried in Lenham in an unmarked grave. Now I know for sure that George's father and grandfather were buried in Lenham. I've probably walked past both of them several times, but one is too worn down and the other is unmarked. I'm almost sure that the small flat gravestone is one of them, but how can I prove it? Well, I was headed back to find out. But first, I want to pay a quick visit to Ware, England. There are actually 2 cities named Ware, but the one in Kent is most likely where we're from.
This is Ware Road in Ware, England. It doesn't get any more Ware than this.
It's literally a handful of houses. I couldn't even find anyone to talk to. But I was so preoccupied with the Lenham Cemetery that I didn't stick around very long. I got to Lenham the next day bright and early to clean off the gravestone. Nothing works better than a little Coca-Cola. The Coke and toothbrush helped. I could now make out the word years to prove that it was an actual gravestone. Could this be George's dad, who was so poor that he couldn't afford a gravestone like his brother James? I still didn't have an answer. I was also there early to go to church. I planned on asking the church leadership and also the man upstairs for help on finding the gravestones. Church was a disappointment. The leadership had no new information. I was frustrated and went out and sat next to James' gravestone. As I sat there, I noticed something that I hadn't seen before during my several previous searches. The name Elizabeth on a gravestone behind James. The top portion was so covered with moss that nothing was legible, and I knew that about half of the cemetery was named Elizabeth. But it was just enough to pique my interest. So I scraped like I've never scraped before. And there it was, the reason that I was in England. I had finally found the gravestone of George and Elizabeth Ware. The top portion has probably been under moss for 100 years, so it's hard to distinguish it in a photo. In memory of George Ware, who departed this life December 9th, 1801, aged 65 years, surviving 2 sons and 2 daughters, George, James, Elizabeth, and Mary. Below the kids' names is a religious quote that I can't really make out. And then below that it says, also Elizabeth, wife of the above, who died May 10th, 1809, aged 63 years. And then below that is a religious quote. Father, I give my spirit up and trust it in thy hand. My dying flesh shall rest in hope and rise at thy command. I made an etching of the gravestone, and then left a rose on what I believed to be George's father's grave. And then I just sat there and cried. I imagined my grandpa next to me. He would have been crying too. I guess it's in the Ware genes. I read the gravestone over and over again. I couldn't believe that I had finally found it. The pinnacle of this epic trip. I was so excited. It was definitely time to celebrate. Oh wait, I forgot that I'm alone in a foreign country. Who could I celebrate with? The girls on the subway were definitely not very fired up. I guess my celebration would just have to wait for another day. And besides, I have a big day tomorrow. When George was 22 years old, he married Naomi. She was 22 as well, actually slightly older. After they had their children in 1838, at the ages of 45, they met a missionary from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as the Mormons. They were both baptized, along with several children. From that point forward, they were planning to join the Mormons in the Rocky Mountains. The first step was to move the entire family to Preston, England, because the boats left through Liverpool. So my next stop in the journey is Preston, England. Preston is a long drive, so I had plenty of time to think. I thought about random stuff like that singer Jessie Ware. I would bet £1,000 that we are related through Smith or Attained or one of those other gravestones that I visited. I mean, come on, she's from England, she has my last name, and she's like super cool. That's pretty much all of the criteria to be aware. Then randomly I started thinking about that scripture in Malachi, about turning your hearts to your fathers or else you'll be cursed. What kind of curse are we talking about here? Before I could think too much about it, my phone beeped, and it was a Facebook update from my cousin Aaron Ware. He was at that very moment on the same island as me, just a few hundred miles north in Scotland. Then I saw pictures of him staying in a castle and golfing at the world's most exclusive courses. I kind of got jealous and decided right then and there that if our family did get a curse, that it should go to Aaron. And the curse should be to eternally hook every ball he hits into the deep St. Andrew's grass. But then again, I thought he probably did that anyways. All right, back to the story. When George left to America, he left behind several of his kids, who were all adults at that point. And 5 generations later, my cousins still live in Preston. And for the first time in my family's history, we were about to reunite. This is my 5th cousin Keith. He lives in Preston with his wife and 2 kids. He has done some serious research into family history. He was actually the one who reached out to my family through my Uncle Wayne a few years back. And since then, they've remained in contact. We both trace our genealogy back to George. I go through his son Samuel, and Keith goes through his son John, who stayed behind in Preston. He took me to breakfast to show me all of the work that he has done. He definitely has a passion for family history. After breakfast, Keith took me to the old Preston cemetery to see the gravestones of George's children that stayed behind. We also found Keith's grandmother, whose maiden name is Ware. The graves were divided based on religion. There was a section for Catholics, Muslims, Protestants, and Jews. And of course, there was a section for nonconformists. George's kids were buried in the nonconformist section, so they definitely didn't agree with their parents when it came to religion. After the cemetery, we headed to lunch so I could meet more of the family. This meal was one of my favorite parts of the journey. It was a connection that I wish I would have made many years ago. To my left is my cousin Rob. He is a future attorney and hardcore Man United fan. Next to Rob is my cousin Carrie. She is Keith's daughter and just graduated as a teacher. She is really gorgeous. I'm allowed to say that since we're cousins. Next to Carrie is my uncle Derek. He's Rob's dad and Keith's brother. He's a retired businessman and also a big Man U fan. And last but not least, to the far right is Keith, a retired IT technician and family history guru, and he supports Preston South End. We probably stayed for an extra hour after our meal, just talking and laughing. I hope to see them all again very soon. Liverpool is less than an hour from Preston, and it's much larger than I expected. It's like a mini London. This was the staging ground for most immigrants headed to America. This is where George and Naomi left in 1855, after they had spent many years waiting in Preston. This is a statue of a young Mormon family preparing to migrate to the New World. It is, quote, a tribute to the many families from all over Europe who embarked on a brave and pioneering voyage from Liverpool to start a new life in America, unquote. The statue overlooks the port and a walkway along the sea. People often walk down the path and put a lock on the fence as a long-lasting memorial to something. I I've seen it done in other places during my travels. So I had a special lock engraved with George's name on it and the year that he left this port, and secured it to the fence. If you are ever in Liverpool and want to find it, just follow the male statue's eyes to the water, and you can't miss it. The ship they were scheduled to sail on, the Helios, sprang a leak and they had to return to port in Liverpool. When they finally set sail on the Charles Buck, most of the food items were left on the first ship, so they had to ration food and water all the way. For most of the journey, they were hungry and sick. They were on the open ocean for 56 days. After finally reaching the port of New Orleans, they sailed up the mighty Mississippi and then up the Missouri until they arrived in Atchison, Kansas. When George and his family finally arrived in Atchison, they were hungry and sick. But the journey was far from over. From Atchison, they had to walk 5 miles to a place called Mormon Grove, a tent city that was an important rallying point for Mormons preparing to head west to the Rockies. This road was just a dirt trail back then, but it's the same path that George and his family took. Mormon Grove is the city that disappeared. There were only a few permanent structures, and most people lived in wagon carts and tents. It is now just a field owned by a farmer and his family. There is an historical marker placed at the site. I spoke with a landowner. He was a nice guy and proud to own a piece of history. He pointed out where the Mormon Grove was, a couple 100 yards from the sign, in this valley, near those trees. When George arrived here at Mormon Grove, he was so sick from his long journey that he passed away on April 16th, 1855. His family buried him the next day in an unmarked grave. The cemetery is about a quarter of a mile from Mormon Grove. Due to a cholera outbreak, it was outside the city. Apparently, when they put in the highway, they tried to find it and drilled holes in the suspected cemetery's location and pulled up wood pieces that were consistent with coffins. So the landowner has a good idea of the cemetery's location. He said to go through his double gate on the other side of the road and walk along the cornfield and look for a small group of trees between the cornfield and the hayfield. There I would find the unmarked cemetery. There I would find George. Here is the group of trees where the hay and cornfields meet. Well, this is it, the unmarked cemetery at Mormon Grove. That tree looks like it was cut down 150 years ago to make coffins.
Come on, I have one more thing left to do.
Using the outline of his grandfather's headstone in his birthplace of Lenham, I created a headstone for my George. It reads, "In memory of George Ware, who departed this life in 1855, aged 62 years." I also taped the rubbing from his grandfather's grave to symbolize how far he had come. Now, the only thing left to do was pay my respects to the man who sacrificed his life for his future generations.
Give me the camp where the fire is the lamp, the breeze is so pure and light that I would not exchange my home on the range for all of the city so bright. Oh, I love these wildflowers in this dear land of ours, the curlew I love to hear scream, and I love the white rocks and the antelope flocks that graze on the mountains so green. Oh, give me a land where the bright diamond sand flows leisurely down the stream, where the graceful white swan goes gliding along like a maid